Esther was asking us a question because that question is tied to the topic that is two-wheeler and mass transit nexus. The question she was asking was about whether we have public transport. And now I can answer it. We have public transport, but we do not have mass transit. I don't know whether that is now right. We will come to discuss that. There is public transport, yes, a lot of it, but when it comes to a maximization in the context of having a mass transit, there we have a deficit. And that's why when I was invited to give a talk, I think originally, Olive, we were talking about moving from two-wheeler to mass transit. And I couldn't conceptualize it. I struggled with conceptualizing that. But it was easier for me to look at the nexus. Because if you look across Africa and even across the world, even in the most developed world, we still have the other side, the paratransit. But they serve a different purpose, probably fairing the sick, special needs. That's what they do. I would just reflect on about 4 points. Trying to look at understanding paratransit and also understanding mass transit. And then I'll look at the nexus briefly of those two. And then I'll give some case studies and then look at whether there is a possibility of integrating two-wheeler into mass transit. Don't bother to look deeply into this PowerPoint, but just the 3 words on it, which is access, transport development, two-wheelers, and mass transit. Those are what it is communicating there. And I decided to pull what General Babaginda Ibrahim once said when they were putting in place a mass transit. He said that immobility perpetuates poverty, and an immobile nation is a poor nation. And mobility is impossible without transport development. That's why I say the concept of transport development is important. And having all stakeholders here is critical because no single entity, not the commission, not the government, not the paratransits, can develop transport without each other. And we are all here working together and can contribute to this discussion. So usually, when you look at the concept of the two-wheelers, the concept of two-wheelers moving towards mass transit, there have been attempts. There have been attempts across the globe to move the minibuses and the midi-buses to formalize them, either by forming companies to run mass transit or just purchasing better vehicles. All these have been tried, and we will see as we go along. I put this because some of you know Todd Littman. I'm sure the commissioner, you have read about Todd Littman. When I was struggling to get cases, can we get cases where two-wheelers have moved to transit? I couldn't get them. So I tried to contact some of my friends who are really known in this sector. And one of them was Littman, Todd. I wrote to him an email and told him, Todd, you have to send me good case studies to share when in Entebbe, in Kampala. But this is what he said. It was like asking, can two-wheelers move to mass transit? And his email says, that's a good question. I am afraid that I do not have a good answer. Public transportation is overall more efficient than motorized two-wheelers, considering all costs, including vehicles, fuel, drivers, labor, roads, parking facilities, but it experiences strong economies of scale. So public transit only works well after it is well established. So we started with Esther's question about public transport. So it can't work well if it's not well established. And to have it well established, we have to all come together. And we have to look at all modes of transport. We have to give them all, they are all systems. Whether it's a tuk-tuk, whether it's a minibus, whether it's a boat, whether it's a bicycle, they are all modes and they are systems. So when we are at still the first point where I think Kenya and Uganda are, because we haven't put the ideal system, we have to appreciate all the modes. And then we see how those modes work for us. In other words, let's not begin from what we don't have to go to what we have. Let's begin from what we have to develop what we want. And I think that's a decision countries have have to make. And many times African countries don't make it easily. So the last word he says is, unfortunately, African cities lack a tradition of efficient, integrated public transit services, What we were being asked by Esther, we lack it. What we were being asked to say yes for, we lack it. So it will be difficult, but I don't belong to his last part of the response to my email. I don't belong there. He says, so it will be difficult to establish now. So he kind of dismisses that we shouldn't even struggle. We are not ready for it. Commissioner, you will tell us something about that later. We are being told, don't even bother. And I think he's arguing that way because he's moving from what is, looking at Africa and what Africa has, he sees it will be difficult. But I say that's not necessarily the case. Okay, so these PowerPoints, we've already highlighted them quite, just trying to indicate that the public transport has been a concern in African cities. And of course, we see a dominance of paratransit. Many African states call it intermediate transport. Again, Commissioner, you will tell us why you call it intermediate transport when we have no other transport. But it is called intermediate if you read literature. But we are also seeing emerging state-initiated mass transit systems. So we have paratransit or intermediate transport, but we are also seeing some emerging works, a lot of countries working towards mass transit. And then we also have new mobilities. I had WRI is here. WRI is here, hi there. They are doing a lot of work on these areas, and she'll be able to share later maybe with us. Because these emerging mobilities have their space. In other words, Africans are struggling between many parameters. Because here you are dealing with paratransit or immediate transport. Here you are trying to plan to design a mass transport. Here you are with a lot of agencies, private sector coming up, trying to convince you that forget about, get new mobilities, electrify the motorcycles. So are you going to prioritize electrifying the motorcycles and moving on, or are you going to prioritize mass transit? I think those are the struggles Africa have to deal with. I picked these pictures on understanding paratransit because it really depends what you pick. If you look at these pictures, are they not providing transport? Are the visuals problematic? Who finds these visuals problematic as far as transport is concerned? Hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 people, 7. 7 people find them problematic. Olive, tell us, why are they problematic?
Upper corner.
Yes.
This lady, if they hit a hump, she's going to fall off.
Yes.
She is going to hit her head on the road.
Yes.
And for me, that's completely unacceptable. So I could speak to every one of those, but I think the lady is a serious concern there.
Thank you very much. Olive, they also don't have helmet. We could go on from those ones like a carriage with the three whatever. So I think it's how we conceptualize them. So when we get to the meaning of paratransit, because this is where we are, paratransit is where we are, intermediate transport is what we have. We are trying to improve it, we are trying to get to mass transit, but what we have is this. So we cannot have a stakeholders meeting that does not appreciate this particular transport that is on board. You remember our earlier definition of public transport, which we had a problem with, but I think the key difference between paratransit and mass transit is the issue of scheduling, programming, fares that are actually known and all that. So if you look at the systems themselves, what you get to see across Africa are the mini, medium, and all those two-wheelers, three-wheelers, bicycles, and of course the dominance are the two now. With the two-wheeler, which I'm supposed to talk to more, almost bypassing now the other one, although because they carry fewer, they can't easily bypass the mini and the midibus. The attributes of this particular particular mode is, I don't even know whether sometimes these things apply. They don't apply across, but they are considered cheaper, accessible, and flexible solutions. I think flexible because they are very proactive, the paratransit. They will know which routes need, need transport and all that, and nobody's coordinating them. They self-coordinate. And issues of operating as informal businesses is another element. This is across Africa. I'm not pointing Uganda. There are Ugandans here who are going to have a panel here, and they will bring insights for the Ugandan case. Low quality vehicles, that's quite true across Africa. Poor management and poor enforcement of regulations. We have the Regulations and Safety Authority here, and we just finished a study about 3 months ago with the World Bank, African Development Bank, and WHO, and I think Uganda contributed, on road safety lead agencies in Africa. We covered 16 African countries, and the study is all out. I hope they've shared it with you, Commissioner. If they've not, I will share with you if it's not yet officially published. And really, these are the issues that the roads safety authorities, the lead agencies are dealing with. Issues of safety, issues of regulations. And when you come in terms of poor enforcement, I think that's really the poor enforcement of regulations, which is not only from the government perspective, from also our perspective as operators or us as commuters, is what is making us throw away these other modes of transport. Because we failed to regulate them, therefore they are not useful. Hopefully we will see how we will regulate, or how we are regulating the transit systems. People are already facing challenges even with transit systems. So when it comes to operations, how they operate, basically there are several, they serve several markets, and often they are the sole public transport services, which is very critical. And sometimes when you have put mass transit, like if we dare put Kenya and Uganda, we are almost at the same level, really trying to put mass transit in place, they can end up competing. And when they compete, there are all other issues around competition, or they can be a replacement for unproductive fixed routes. Because a mass transit will not operate when it can't make money. If it can't make money, if it's a company, it will mean the state or the city authority will provide subsidy. So if there is no subsidy, then there is no transport on that route. Then the paratransit will have to fill that gap, which is quite a plus. Of course, they can also act as feeder or distributor service to the fixed routes. And in some cases, they can use it as an experiment of a route, so that we can see the viability of that particular route to the paratransit if we ever get to that level of having that. The two-wheeler that we are talking about, as the two-wheeler is part of paratransit, I don't want to see them as different. They are part of the intermediate transport. And of course, they come in several types. Some of them are for sports, but we are focusing on the ones that focus on public transport. And of course, Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania, we are among the leading countries using this particular mode. And of course, we do agree that they fill a gap in public transport, and they are important in both urban and rural. But rural, maybe we are not talking about rural, I don't know, we will hear later whether we are also looking at rural. In rural, they are like the main mode of transport, the two-wheeler. And in Africa, is almost becoming now a norm that they are able to penetrate all those hills and areas that the public transport, mass transit cannot reach. Of course, they provide employment to the youth, and they are also good at managing congestion, traffic jams, and fuel efficiency. And of course, the flip side, they are viewed as pollutants, and there is a push for having internal combustion engines on them. And that's what I was talking about, the new mobilities. When you look at the other side now, what Esther had presented to us, where we want to be, the mass transit is where we really want to be, because we do appreciate, I also acknowledge that mass transit is good, but I do not argue that once you have mass transit, you should not have paratransit. my conceptualization is that two have to operate together, and it is how you organize and program them that will determine the operations of a particular city or a particular country. So most of Africa is going the bus rapid transit. They are not going a little bit of some with rail transit like Ethiopia, but basically we are into bus transit. That is where most African countries are. The metro and the undergrounds that we find in the Western world, almost nobody's talking about them, and they're also very complex and very expensive to put in place. Of course, when we look at the transit, the ideal that we are talking about, it combines all those good words. There would be good stations, you know, where you can sit and rest as you wait. It's all good environment. The vehicles are good and smart, efficient. There is running ways for them. There is flexible operating plan, and the technology is right. And of course, with that, you satisfy customer needs. And of course, that is all, that definition I put there is from the Canadian Urban Transit Association. And they are viewed, mass transit are viewed as revolutionary system, rapidly expanding around the world. But as we view them, so, especially in the African context, let's not be blind to what we have and what we can afford. Because issue of affordability and financing is very critical in putting a system in place. So we need to consider which option, and that's why the bus rapid is being picked up, because at least it has low capital investment compared to the other two. I just pulled this from the World Bank publication, and basically it's just showing you how this mass transit is now penetrating. The red ones are already in place, you know. South Africa has the majority, as you can see red at the bottom. A number of cities, about 4+, already have, and South Africa has conceptualized the whole thing of mass transit at a national level, and the provinces and the cities are just implementing. And you can see, Dar es Salaam, you know, did theirs, also great for the East African region. Ethiopia, I think, is almost complete. They are complete. It's not showing red, but they are complete. They are running in Ethiopia. They have BRT, and they also have light rail. And then you have the rest. So it's good to know that Africa is embracing this, you know, good practices, and we also have the space to consider embracing the same as Uganda and Kenya. And we are glad that we are already in the step. Kenya, I think, almost in the last step. We have some stations already in the first corridor, which is the Thika Superhighway. We already have some stations pitched, ready for the BRT. You all know about our red line, which everybody laughed about. We drew a red line on the Thika Highway and left it for about 4 years, just a red line that is the BRT line. But now we've begun putting some of the elements that will make it real. So you compare this with what we had seen earlier, where Olive knew there was a problem in that one. Olive, is this one having a problem? It's better. She says it is better. So that's good. We are moving from something that is not so good to something that is, this is what everybody is campaigning for. So when we talk about the Nexus, and we talk about movement, so we can move from the first pictures we saw to these pictures, and just scrap off the other first pictures we saw. But I am arguing that we will never reach that stage so soon in Africa. We need to get both. The issue is determining where each operates. If Kampala decides to have 3 corridors, Kenya has decided to have 5 corridors. The first corridor is about to go, and we'll develop corridors incrementally as we continue to have resources. So Uganda will also have to decide how many corridors, and once you decide on the corridors, then you have to decide whether you remove the paratransit from that corridor or they become feeder. That becomes a decision that entities have to make. So these are the attributes of the mass transit. It's seen to be sustainable option. I put a question mark because people might have different ideas about whether they are really sustainable or not, but they are considered sustainable, low cost and flexible, and also they can be implemented very rapidly. They are high performance, and of course they address the challenges of congestion, traffic jams, and pollution. Because they carry more people, they have a dedicated line, the intersections are well designed and well handled. So when you look at then the nexus that I'm talking about, the dominance of paratransit modes of transport, of course, need that integration. And the integration has to be incremental. So I argue for an hybrid system for Africa. And South Africa, I think, came out with this concept of hybridity. And I think the hybridity works, because even in South Africa, where they have mass transit almost in 4 cities or so, the paratransit, the intermediate, is still also operating. The issue is how you design their operation, and that design has to ensure that the paratransit does not interfere with the transit modes in terms of operations. Of course, when you look at the paratransit as feeders of mass transit, that, again, this is a key decision, sometimes political decision. You know, they can operate in an open market. In other words, you can design a system where both just operate the way they want, you know. Even the corridor that you put mass transit, you can leave the paratransits to run on it. That is a decision to be made at a very personal level, entity like cities. There is also area licensing. You can decide to license the paratransit on particular areas so that you kind of secure the transit corridor. There can also be concessions and franchising where actually the very paratransits that we have, the two-wheelers, the minibuses and the midi-buses, convert into companies and become the ones operating the bus rapid transit. And you will see in a few case studies I give. It's not unheard of. So there should never be a threat of a new transport system coming, which is good, and people fear that they will be thrown out of the market. Is all how it is organized and designed. There can also be contracting. And contracting comes in different ways. The ones in Africa are largely the service-based ones, where maybe the city authority or the government decides the routes, the schedules, the quality, and then you operate, and either you are paid per kilometer, REN, or so. And then you have the performance contracting, where you have the service running by a private entity. They decide which route, they decide what quality, and that can be very problematic, but it is also one way. And that one, they would be paid per passenger carried. So if you pay them per passenger carried, that means that if they think a particular route has no people, they won't go that route. And of course, the city authority and the government is responsible for moving people if people have to move. We do also know that currently the conceptual thing in planning is to plan in a way that you reduce the movement. You know, look at land use, reduce movement so that people don't have to move far away from where they live. But all these have to, sorry. Okay, so these are some of the nexus issues. Moving from transit, paratransit to mass transit requires a negotiated decision on specific options. And this is really an issue of all stakeholders, and we are all here. It has to be negotiated. And of course, difficulties associated with accessibility is what contributes to poor performance. In other words, that some locations may not be very accessible. Some locations may not be well served by whichever mode, paratransit or mass transit. And the issue of land use planning, which I've emphasized. Then improving accessibility of passengers and connection to the mass transit. So if Kampala decides to have 3 corridors, and it's not easy because these things are expensive to fund, how are you going to ensure that the other parts of the city is working? And how are you going to ensure that the other modes that are operating ferry people to those corridors into your mass transit, if that is the design that one wants to use? Of course, issue of technology is very critical because you may need to harmonize fares in a way that when one starts with a paratransit, they can change over to a transit system without bothering about getting new tickets. These are, again, things to just be considered. This is sometimes the wrong approach, but we have to also just have it on table. Replacement of paratransit with mass transit. so that you begin from just saying, I don't want to see those pictures we saw at the first instance. All those pictures of a woman being carried in a bike, some people in an open, carriage with a scooter. You don't want to see that. Usually, this option assumes that there is a comprehensive, mass transit. It would assume so. So I don't see Kampala or any city in Uganda or Kenya being able to provide corridors that connect literally the entire metropolitan area of cities. I don't see it in the near future. And that is why when you are replacing, it may just not work. It's not easy to work, phasing out paratransit operators completely. Of course, organization of paratransit in new corporations seems to be a viable option. They can be organized in new corporations and gradually be fully integrated into mass transit modes. That's a good, viable one. Cities do not have, most of our cities do not have the institutional and financial capacity to build and complete BRTs. Many of them are relying on support, both technical and financial, from external support. And of course, gaps will always exist. Even where you think you have enough corridors, gaps will always exist. So indeed, paratransit requires incentives. If we want to put them on other routes, which are maybe not very viable, you might have to give some incentives. And the incentives, I think, are best known to the system people. Just a bit of an example, just running through an example. Lagos was the first city to have a BRT system running. And what is important here is that one thing you need to note is that when they had that, you can see public transport was the majority, which will be different from Cape Town, which I also show next, which was more private. Here, the public transport was already there. So this public transport was not mass transit. It was just the minibuses and all that. The minibuses, the Danfos, the midi, all that we are talking about in Kenya was what they had. They were in our situation now of Kenya and Uganda. Of course, they went for a BRT light. BRT light, sometimes I call it pseudo BRT. It may not have the ideal type as written in the book, but it will be serving the purpose. So this has been on and faring quite some. In terms of implementation of this particular case study, they examined the regulatory framework before they could put in place, and they also established an agency, which is called LAMATA. Kenya has equivalently established an agency, which is called NAMATA. That is Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority. This is Lagos Metropolitan Area Transport Authority. And we are not saying you have to establish a new entity. You will see in Cape Town did not establish a new entity. Cape Town went on with just using the city itself to continue. So you don't necessarily need to establish a new authority. Of course, the buy-in is very critical. The buy-in, where you create awareness, you talk to the operators, you get a common understanding, they get to know what is coming, and they become part of the discussion of that particular thing. And then, of course, establishing financial viability, and of course, demonstrating quick wins. This is very important. Let's not shock operators with a one-off, very big bang type of approach. You can go incremental and pick the things that are very easy to run away with in a harmonious way. And of course, we have to empower not only formal institutions, also the informal institutions. If the paratransits have their organizations, they may need strengthening to understand what's about to occur in the city. And last, monitoring and the buy-in, I will not elaborate, is the most important in getting a new system. You have to get a buy-in from the current operating system. If you don't get a buy-in from those that are currently operating, you are likely not to go far. But you have to partner with all this. And in the Lagos case, they partnered with the National Union of Transport Workers. That is the one that made them succeed. They did not walk alone. They worked with that union. They took them out into Latin America to get to see how it works, and so that they could believe. So all that were done, and they ended up being part of the BRT. They were part of the BRT in terms of having companies, and they also acted in feeder roads, like I've been saying. In the Cape Town case, you can see that first it's a smaller town, a smaller city compared to the other one. But when you see the model split, cars was 67%. People who are in cars was 67%. The other one was about 70, but public transport. So this can even be more difficult to move people to transit, depending on how you design and how you connect the city appropriately. And this, of course, was very rushed. If you remember, they wanted to catch the FIFA which was taking place there. So the first phase, the first phase gave them a chance to test things for the FIFA. They gave the paratransit options to ferry people, so they already were learning the art of getting into this system. And this has kind of worked very well. In terms of implementation, of course, powers on this particular case study was to the city authority. They didn't create an Amata or a Lamata, like I've said before, but they used the city authority, and of course the trunk, the development of bus service on the trunk, and they also negotiated with the taxi owners, and two associations became the providers of some of the routes, which was then very positive. And of course, at the end of the day, they were given long-term contracts for 12 years to run the BRT. So basically what this case shows is that when we think of mass transit, we should not stop thinking of the paratransits. They can themselves become the operators of the mass transit. So that is the nexus that I'm talking about. In South Africa, again, they had what they call taxi recapitalization. This is where they were able to buy off. You buy off the paratransits, you buy their cars. If they are so old and cranky, you scrap them off. So some were scrapped off, but you are paid. But some that could fit in got to fit in. And you can see by 2017, they had 700 taxis had been removed, and 337 operators had been compensated. Old vehicles were scrapped, and of course, taxi routes altered or discontinued to make way for BRT. So these are hard options that we have to consider. So the My City schedule, which runs in Cape Town, is quite a scheduled system. That is where we are heading for. It's a good transit. In terms of two-wheelers, again, we get to two-wheelers because it's our focus. I must note that the two-wheelers are an excellent mode for poorly served areas and feeder roads. They can serve the non-served areas, and they can serve at feeders. And of course, we have to see them as part of paratransit. And of course, inclusion in planning has to be there. They have to be on table as well, so that during the negotiations, they can also contribute. And of course, safety, safety, safety. They have to embrace safety. And their biggest challenge and problem across Africa is lack of safety and recklessness and not caring about giving good service. This can change if people work hard. And to conclude, I think there is the synergy. I think the synergy of paratransit and mass transit and the need for sustainable, well-informed public transport solutions is what one would call for. And of course, the centrality of government and city authority in leading, not in just monopolizing, but in leading the development of transport policy and master plan. Because once we have clarity of transport policy and we have a master plan, that master plan will show us how things fit in and what we can do and what we can't do. That was done in Cape Town, that was done in Lagos, so even in Kenya and Uganda, we have to get the plan. Don't start using a one-off shot, but let's have a grand plan and see how that grand plan fits within the entire thing. Issues of regulations and enforcement and intervention to improve paratransit. Are we negative about paratransit because we have failed to enforce regulations, or because the paratransits cannot comply to regulations? Why are we negative about paratransits? We need to ask that question. We need to institutionalize platforms for engagement of transport stakeholders for efficient operations and transition to mass transit. There has to be that platform like this one today, where we keep discussing and talking and contributing. And last, not least, we need collaborative upgrading. Collaborative upgrading of paratransit systems and integration into formal system. So at the end of the day, we need an integrated output. We need an integrated transport system where each system that we think in our policy is relevant takes its space and operates efficiently. Thank you.